Welcome back to Whispering Shadows. Tonight's stories are not about haunted houses in the usual sense, and they're not the kind of fears that disappear when the lights come on. This episode is about something colder than a ghost story, the feeling that you've gone too far down a lonely road, too deep into a quiet field, or too far inside a place where there is nowhere left to run. Out in the countryside, with the dark pressing close and the world reduced to a few narrow lanes, a barn light in the distance, or a house standing alone against the black, the terror changes shape. It stops being about what you can see and becomes about what the place itself knows. And what makes these accounts worse is that they aren't internet fiction or campfire legend. They come from real witness statements, cross-checked details, and in some cases records that were hard to explain away. Names change. Locations are obscured. But the events themselves were reported by people who believed they were describing something they truly lived through. That is the thread running through tonight's episode. Not just fear, but the slow realization that something is wrong in a way that feels hidden, deliberate, and very old. If you want more unexplained files like these, subscribe and stay close to Whispering Shadows, because some roads only look empty until you start hearing what's still there. And if you've ever had a place that felt wrong the moment you arrived, leave a comment and tell me why, quietly, if you prefer, because the first story begins on a country road where the map stopped making sense long before the narrator realized he was being watched. The worst part was realizing my uncle hadn't just died on that ranch, he had died because of it. A week after Uncle Raymond passed, I got a call from his estate attorney saying I'd inherited a cattle ranch in a remote part of Montana. At first, I almost thought it was some kind of mistake. I hadn't seen Raymond in years, and the idea that he'd left me thousands of acres of land out in the middle of nowhere felt unreal. But the lawyer was serious. The paperwork was real, and within days I was driving west with a folder full of legal documents and a head full of questions. The first thing that hit me when I reached the property was how ordinary it looked. Too ordinary, actually. The fences were intact, the barn was freshly repaired, the fields were in decent shape, and the whole place seemed far better maintained than you'd expect after the death of the man who owned it. There were no signs of neglect, no obvious mess, no sense that the ranch had been abandoned in a hurry. It felt less like an inherited property, and more like a place someone was still quietly managing behind the scenes. Inside Raymond's office, I started going through his papers, hoping to find a simple explanation for why he'd left me the ranch. Instead, I found something that made my stomach tighten. He had kept detailed logs of vehicles coming and going late at night, written in his precise handwriting, with dates, times, descriptions, and plate numbers. Some entries were marked with circles and arrows, like he was tracking patterns. Others had notes in the margins that looked more like warnings than observations. What caught my attention right away was a hidden access road he documented that wasn't on any map I'd seen. It ran behind the main barn, down a rough stretch of land that was easy to miss if you didn't know it was there. I followed it on foot, and after a few minutes I came to a metal building set back from the rest of the property. It was painted to blend in with the ranch, but the security around it made no sense for an ordinary storage shed. There were fresh tire marks nearby, a reinforced lock, and enough dirt on the ground to show it had been used constantly. The door was unlocked. That alone should have made me leave, but curiosity and a growing sense of dread pushed me inside. The air was cold enough to bite. Inside, I found industrial freezer units humming against the walls, steel tables that had been scrubbed so hard they shone, and shelves stacked with invoices, labels, and inventory sheets. Nothing about it looked like ranch equipment. Then I saw the worst part: bags, wallets, driver's licenses, jewelry, and personal items sorted into bins as if they were evidence, or maybe leftovers. They belonged to missing people. I remember standing there, unable to move, staring at a child's shoe and a woman's wedding ring sitting together in one tray. Everything in me was screaming to get out, but I was frozen by the sheer scale of what I was seeing. This wasn't a hidden room. This was a disposal site, a place built to erase people. I barely had time to back away before I heard voices outside. Men were coming. I killed the light and slipped behind a stack of metal shelving, trying not to breathe too loudly. Through the crack under the door, I saw boots, flashlights, and the outline of armed men stepping inside like they belonged there. They weren't surprised to find the building open. That was the scariest part. They moved with the easy confidence of people returning to a place they used often. I stayed hidden while they talked, and what I heard made my skin go cold. They were discussing my uncle, not with grief, not even with anger, with irritation. They said Raymond had started keeping records, that he'd become a problem, that poison had been used because it had to look natural. One of them said they should have finished it sooner. Another said they couldn't afford another mistake now that the nephew had shown up. I understood then that Raymond hadn't died peacefully at all. He had been silenced. I waited until they left. Every muscle in my body locked tight. Then I grabbed every document I could carry. I took the logs, invoices, IDs, and anything that looked like proof. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely fit the papers into a bag. I didn't stop until I was back on the road and the ranch was behind me. I drove straight to the state police. At first, I don't think they believed me. I wouldn't have believed me either if I hadn't seen it, but the evidence was too much to ignore. Once investigators went out to the property, the whole thing started to unravel. They uncovered a long-running operation involving multiple families and a network built around hiding bodies, covering tracks, and making people disappear. By the time it was over, the case was tied to at least 19 murders, maybe more. In the end, I walked away from the ranch. I wanted nothing to do with that land after what I'd found there. The inheritance wasn't a gift, it was a trap, or maybe a final warning from a man who knew he was running out of time. I sold what I could, surrendered the rest, and tried to build a life somewhere that didn't sit on top of secrets. But I still think about Raymond. I think about him keeping those records late at night, knowing exactly what was happening around him. I think about how long he must have been watching, waiting for someone to notice, and how alone he must have felt when he realized the people he was exposing were already too close. And sometimes, when I replay it all in my head, I wonder if he left me the ranch because he trusted me to uncover the truth, or because he knew I was the only one who might survive long enough to tell it. The first time the wall in that Oregon farmhouse exhaled, I thought I was imagining it. I had bought the place because it was cheap, isolated, and perfect for the renovation series I planned to post online. It sat on a stretch of damp farmland outside a tiny town, with sagging porches, warped windows, and paint peeled down to gray wood underneath. To anyone else, it looked like a losing investment. To me, it looked like content, a dramatic before and after, a long project, a new beginning. For the first few days, everything felt ordinary. Dust, rot, dead bugs, mouse droppings, the usual heartbreak of an abandoned house. I tore out carpet, scraped mold from the bathroom, and started peeling away layers of wallpaper in the front room. That was when I noticed something odd. One section of plaster sounded hollow when I knocked on it. At first I assumed it was just old damage, but the more I tapped around, the more I found these strange pockets hidden inside the walls, sealed behind patchwork repairs and layers of paint. Curiosity got the better of me. I cut into the first cavity and pulled back a rotten board. Inside was a nest of bird bones, dozens of tiny skeletons arranged with eerie care, not tossed in, not forgotten, set in shapes. Spirals, lines, a symbol I didn't recognize. The feathers were long gone, but the arrangement looked intentional enough to make my stomach tighten. I remember just standing there with plaster dust on my hands, staring into the dark hole in the wall, trying to tell myself there had to be some harmless explanation. There wasn't. A few days later, I found another sealed space behind the kitchen wall. This one held cat skeletons. Not one cat, several. Their bones were spread out in deliberate patterns, like someone had been composing with them. Some were placed in rings, others in the outline of something that looked almost like a handprint. The sight of it hit me harder than the first discovery, because birds could have been an accident, a weird old nest, a cruel joke. But cats don't end up arranged like that by chance. I stopped working for the rest of the afternoon. I sat in my truck in the driveway, staring at the house as the sky turned the color of dirty wool. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that old houses were full of secrets, and that there was no reason to panic over bones and hidden spaces. Then night came. I was sleeping in a borrowed cot in the living room because the upstairs floors felt unsafe. Around midnight, I woke up to a soft scratching sound moving through the walls. At first it was faint, almost like a mouse dragging claws across the lath. Then it grew louder, slow and deliberate, traveling from one side of the room to the other as if something inside the wall was pacing. I held my breath. The scratching stopped. For a few seconds, the house was silent except for the wind pushing against the siding. Then I heard it, breathing. Deep, wet, patient. It wasn't coming from the room. It wasn't coming from the hallway or the attic or outside the windows. It was coming from inside the wall beside my cot, right where I had opened those hidden cavities. I sat up so fast I nearly tipped the cot over. The sound stayed there, low and even, as if something buried in the plaster had lungs. Then, in the worst moment of my life, I realized the rhythm of it was matching mine. Every time I inhaled, it seemed to follow. Every time I slowed down, it slowed too. When I forced myself to stop breathing altogether, the sound in the wall paused with me, as if it was listening. That was when panic finally hit hard enough to make me grab my flashlight and back out of the room. I spent the rest of the night in my truck with the doors locked, headlights shining across the empty yard. The next morning, I drove straight to the county clerk's office and started digging through records. I told the woman at the desk I was researching the history of the property for a renovation project, which was only partly a lie. She led me to old tax records, deeds, and a yellowed folder that smelled like mildew. The farmhouse had once belonged to a woman named Adeline Marsh. She had lived there for most of her life, alone for the last 20 years, though people in the area seemed to have known her name. Not as a farmer, not as a widow, as a healer. The records were thin, but the local history notes were worse. People claimed Adeline treated sickness with herbs, poultices, and prayers, but there were other rumors too. Children got better after visiting her. Livestock recovered, fevers broke, wounds closed, and when illness couldn't be cured, it was said Adeline could take it somewhere else. There were stories about jars buried under trees, fabric bundles tied shut and hidden in crawl spaces, nails wrapped in charms, and names whispered into fire. One elderly clerk, after checking that no one else was nearby, told me quietly that Adeline believed sickness could be moved out of people and trapped inside objects. Wood, stone, bone, cloth. If the offering was strong enough, the ailment stayed contained. If it wasn't, it found its way back. She had also, according to the records and rumors, sealed parts of the house itself, not just with boards and plaster, but with sacrifice. The more I read, the colder I felt. Suddenly the bones in the walls weren't random at all. They looked like remnants of rituals I had never meant to disturb. The birds, the cats, maybe other things I hadn't found yet. Maybe the walls were not a hiding place but a prison, and I had started breaking the locks one by one. I drove back to the farmhouse in silence. The driveway looked longer than before. The windows looked darker. Even in daylight, the place felt like it was holding its breath. Inside, the air had changed. It was thicker somehow, close and stale, carrying a sour smell that reminded me of wet soil and something animal underneath it. I checked the rooms I had already opened, and every one of them felt wrong. The drywall seemed slightly swollen in places. The seams between boards looked too tight, like the house was trying to hold itself together. That evening, I heard movement again, not scratching this time. A shifting, shuffling sound, something pressing from the inside of the walls, moving slowly from one room to the next. Then came the breathing again, louder now, no longer hidden. It filled the house with a heavy, pulsing presence that made my skin crawl. I left. I got in my truck and drove to a motel 20 miles away. But the next day, the farmhouse was worse. The wallpaper I had peeled back in the front room was hanging in strips like skin. The cat bones I'd uncovered were gone from the cavity, though I never touched them after finding. There were damp marks on the floor beneath the walls, and several of the nails I had used to brace the plaster had been pulled out from the inside. On one of the boards, someone had scratched a shape into the wood. It looked like a crooked mouth. Over the next few nights, the breathing spread. It moved through the walls, from the kitchen to the hallway to the upstairs rooms I hadn't even entered yet. Sometimes it came in bursts, fast and hungry. Sometimes it was slow and patient, like an old person dozing in a chair. And every time, it seemed to know exactly when I was listening. I stopped filming. I stopped sleeping inside. I barely went near the house unless I had to. But it didn't matter. The place was changing. Doors stuck where they hadn't before. Cold patches appeared in the middle of rooms. Once, I heard my own name spoken from behind the bathroom wall in a voice so faint and blurred it might have been the wind, except it wasn't the wind. The sound came from inside the plaster, muffled and intimate, like someone with their mouth pressed close to the other side. That was the moment I knew I wasn't dealing with an old house anymore. I was dealing with something that had been kept alive by secrecy, by fear, by years of being fed into walls and forgotten. And I had let it out. So I made a decision. If the house was a vessel, then the only way to stop it was to destroy the vessel completely. I waited until night, when the wind had picked up and the property sat dead quiet beneath a moon hidden by clouds. I soaked the main floor with gasoline, pouring it through the hall, into the front room, along the baseboards, and down into the places where the walls had opened. Then I stood outside with shaking hands and lit a match. The fire took fast. At first it was just a low roar from inside the rooms, followed by a sharp crackle as the old wood caught. Then the flames climbed the walls, crawling over the peeling wallpaper and bursting through broken windows. Heat rolled out across the yard so hard it made me stumble backward. Through the blaze, I thought I saw movement in the upper windows. Not smoke, not just collapsing beams, something darker, thicker, shifting behind the glass as if the house itself were trying to stand up. The breathing came once more, loud enough to hear over the fire. Then there was a sound like a deep sigh, almost human, almost relieved, and the roof caved in. I watched until the whole place was nothing but a burning shell. By dawn, all that remained was a blackened foundation, twisted nails, and the smell of ash clinging to everything. I told the sheriff there had been an electrical fire. Nobody pushed too hard. Old houses burn all the time, especially ones no one has cared for in years. The truth stayed with me, though. It followed me home. It sat beside me in quiet rooms. It crept into my sleep. Even now, I don't buy abandoned houses anymore. I don't laugh at strange noises in the walls. I don't open plaster just to see what's behind it. And sometimes, late at night, when the room is perfectly still and I'm lying awake listening to my own breathing, I hear another breath join mine. Slow, wet, patient, as if something buried deep in the dark has never stopped waiting for me to come back. The first thing that told me something was wrong was the map. The road should have turned into a marked county route, but instead it just kept narrowing, climbing into the pines until the GPS gave up and showed nothing but a blank gray smear. I was already 3 hours north of anything sensible, heading into an isolated valley in Idaho to take a veterinary assistant job. And by the time I crossed the last ridge, I had the unsettling feeling that I wasn't driving into a place so much as disappearing into one. The valley itself looked ordinary at a glance, which somehow made it worse. Wide fields, rusted fence lines, a cold river cutting through dark timber, a few scattered farms nestled between the slopes. But there was an odd sameness to everything, as if the whole place had been built from the same memory. Every barn had the same red paint faded to the same chalky pink. Every gate carried the same iron pattern. Every cow, horse, and sheep bore the same brand, a twisted mark that looked less like a ranch symbol and more like a brand burned into skin by something that had decided livestock were only partly animal. There were 5 families living in the valley, and they were all related somehow. Cousins, second cousins, in-laws, widows, stepchildren, half-brothers. The connections were so tangled, I stopped trying to map them after the first week. They all spoke as if they were one household spread across several farms. They all shared tools, meat, labor, and stories. And they all talked about the herd the way other people talk about weather or God. Not their herds. The herd, that was the word they used, always with a strange kind of respect. They said the herd knew when someone was sick, knew when the ground was hungry, knew when a storm was coming, knew what each family needed before anyone asked. They said the herd gave, and in return the valley fed the herd, Whenever I asked what that meant, they'd smile in the same thin way and change the subject. I was hired to help with calving, injuries, vaccinations, and the kind of emergency work that comes with running animals in a hard, isolated place. The pay was good, the housing came with the job, and at first I was relieved to be somewhere quiet after a messy breakup in a city I'd started to hate. For the first few days, the strangest thing I noticed was that nobody in the valley locked their doors, and nobody seemed to leave after dark. Then I was warned about culling week. They said it like they were warning me about a storm front or a dangerous stretch of road. No outsiders were to be in the fields during culling week, and no questions were to be asked. It was, they told me, a private family matter. I nodded. Of course. I wasn't trying to make trouble, but the way they said it, the lowered voices, the flat eyes, the silence that followed, made me think of funerals. On the second night of culling week, I heard the trucks start before dawn. Not one or two, but several engines coughing to life all across the valley at once. By the time the sky was turning pale, the families were already moving toward the lower fields. I should have stayed in the house. Instead, I followed at a distance, telling myself I was only going to check an injured heifer I'd seen limping the day before. What I found was not a ranch operation and not a slaughter. It was something that made my stomach go tight and cold. In the center of the field stood a stone marker, old and weathered, half sunk into the earth like a gravestone that had been there longer than the fence lines. Around it, the families had gathered in a ring. They wore masks made from cattle skulls, bleached white, the eye sockets dark and hollow. Some of the skulls still had horns attached. The sight of them made the entire field seem like a stage set for a ritual no human being should know how to perform. They were chanting, not loudly, not wildly. It was worse than that. They were chanting in low, measured voices, almost tender, as if they were speaking to something sleeping under the soil. The words weren't English, or at least not English I recognized, and the sound of them carried in the cold air like breath over a grave. Behind the circle stood an elderly woman I hadn't seen before, thin as driftwood, wrapped in a dark coat despite the heat of the day. No one touched her, no one looked at her, and yet she stood there with complete certainty, as if she belonged in the center even while she remained just outside it. Then I understood she wasn't outside the circle at all. She was part of it. The chanting went on for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only minutes. The cattle in the adjacent field were silent, not restless, not nervous, silent. They stood shoulder to shoulder at the fence, staring at the people in the masks with a stillness that made my skin crawl. One of the farmers raised a hand, and the others fell quiet all at once. The old woman stepped forward, and the circle opened for her without a word. I couldn't hear what was said next, only the woman's voice, dry and cracked, answering in a tone so calm it felt unreal. Then one of the masked men brought forward a bowl, and another pressed something into her hands. I saw her fingers close around it, slow and deliberate, like someone accepting communion. After that, the families dispersed as if the whole thing had been nothing more than routine work. The masks came off. The trucks started. The fields emptied. By the time I backed away into the trees, my hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold my phone. The next morning, the old woman was dead. They said she'd passed in her sleep, peacefully, quietly, no suffering. The way they said it was so practiced, so smooth, that it sounded rehearsed. No one cried, no one looked surprised. They simply moved on with their chores, as if death in that valley had the manners of a scheduled appointment. I tried to convince myself I had misunderstood everything I saw. Maybe it was some bizarre old family tradition. Maybe the masks were tied to a heritage I didn't know. Maybe the chanting was grief dressed up as ceremony. But that explanation didn't survive the next day, when I found the symbol carved into my truck. It had been cut deep into the driver's side door, just beneath the handle, where I wouldn't see it until I was close enough to touch it. The mark was the same twisted shape as the brand on the cattle, only sharper, more deliberate, as if someone had drawn it with patience and hatred. There was no mistaking it for a prank. The metal around it had been scraped raw. Whoever did it wanted me to know they had been standing right there while I slept. I left before sunrise the following morning. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I packed what I could, tossed it into the truck, and drove out with the sense that if I looked back, I might see the whole valley watching me from the dark windows of the barns. The road out was somehow easier than the road in. The pines parted, the ridges opened. My phone found a signal after miles of nothing. By the time I reached the first town with a gas station and working coffee, I was already trying to talk myself into believing I had simply been overworked and paranoid. It almost worked, until I went online to check the valley again. It was gone. Not just hard to find, gone in a way that made no sense. The road layout on maps no longer matched what I had driven. The valley itself wasn't labeled anywhere I searched. The nearest county office claimed no such community existed under that name. Even old aerial images seemed warped, blurred, or incomplete in the exact area where the farm should have been. When I asked a local historian about the place, he frowned as if I'd mentioned a dream he was embarrassed to admit he couldn't remember. He kept saying there had never been more than empty land and timber. But I know what I saw, and the worst part is, I don't think the valley wanted to be hidden. I think it wanted to be forgotten only by everyone except the one person who was supposed to witness it. Since leaving, I've had signs turn up in places they shouldn't be. A scrap of hide left on my porch with the brand burned into it. A voicemail of nothing but low, rhythmic chanting before the line clicked dead. A dead calf skull placed on my car windshield at dawn, clean as if it had been washed. Once, in the fogged glass of my bathroom mirror, I found the symbol drawn in a finger's width through the steam, though I was alone in the apartment. I moved twice, then a third time. I stopped telling people about the valley because the story sounds insane as soon as it leaves my mouth. But every so often, usually just after midnight, I still wake up with the feeling that something is standing in the corner of the room, breathing quietly and waiting for me to remember. I don't know what the herd is. I don't know what that community believes it serves, or what it thinks it's been given in return. I only know that I was brought there for a reason, shown something I was never meant to understand, and marked for it afterward. And I know, with a certainty I can't explain, that the valley did not let me go. I thought the first sign was the radio, but it turned out the forest had been waiting for me long before that. For 6 months, I lived alone in a research cabin deep in the Cascade Mountains, miles from the nearest road and even farther from anything that felt human. My job was simple on paper: study how plants communicate, map their chemical signals, and record the way they responded to stress, season, and proximity. In practice, it meant long days collecting samples, muddy boots, cold fingers, and nights so quiet they seemed to press against the walls. The cabin itself was old, half forgotten by the agency that owned it. The roof creaked when the wind rolled down the valley, and the windows fogged from the heat of my little stove. There was one room for sleeping, one table for my instruments, and a narrow shelf packed with notebooks, batteries, and dried food. About 30 feet outside, my test plots were marked with string and metal stakes, each square filled with different species I had planted to observe how they interacted. Nothing strange happened during the first few weeks. Then, at exactly 2:47 every morning, the same thing began. The radio on the shelf would switch on by itself. It was an old, cracked thing left behind by whoever had used the cabin before me. I had never bothered to connect it to anything. It didn't need to be plugged in anyway, because the batteries had been dead the day I arrived. And yet every night, without fail, it came alive at 2:47 a.m. with a burst of static so sharp it sounded almost alive. At first I assumed it was some kind of malfunction. Maybe there was a loose connection. Maybe the batteries weren't as dead as I thought. But the signal was too precise, too regular. The static would crackle for a few seconds. Then underneath it, I started hearing a pattern. Not words exactly, but something shaped like language. A rhythm, a sequence, a countdown. I recorded it on my laptop the third night. When I played it back, my skin prickled. Buried in the noise was a voice, or something close to a voice, speaking in a language I had never heard before. It wasn't distorted in the usual way radio sounds are distorted. It felt more like the sound had been squeezed through some narrow crack in reality and came out wrong. The countdown continued every night after that. My sensors started acting up not long after. Soil humidity readings climbed and dropped in impossible spikes. Thermal maps showed warm shapes moving through the plots even though the air was freezing. The spectral analyzers kept detecting chemical exchanges between the plants that did not match any known response pattern in my reference material. I checked the equipment, swapped cables, recalibrated everything twice, then 3 times. The results only got stranger. The plants themselves began to change. At first it was subtle. A row of ferns near the edge of plot 3 bent in the same direction, even when the wind came from the opposite side. Then the stalks in the central bed started leaning at exact angles, as if some invisible hand had arranged them. Soon entire sections of growth formed shapes that were too precise to ignore. Triangles, spirals, interlocking lines, nested curves that repeated with uncanny symmetry. I stood over the plots one morning before sunrise and felt a cold drop of fear sink into my stomach. The arrangement wasn't random. It looked deliberate, as if the plants were following a design I didn't understand. I tried to convince myself it had a natural explanation. Maybe the terrain caused unusual light exposure. Maybe an underground mineral deposit was influencing growth. Maybe I was too isolated, too tired, too eager to assign meaning to patterns. That lasted right up until I found the tower. It sat on a ridge a few miles east of the cabin, an abandoned fire lookout left to rot above the tree line. I had noticed it on a topographic map during my first week, but it took me until the second month to work up the energy to hike there. The climb was brutal, all loose rock, wet roots, and steep switchbacks that seemed to go nowhere. By the time I reached the top, my lungs were burning and my hands were scratched raw from grabbing branches. The lookout tower was worse than I expected. The windows were broken, the stairs were rusted, and the whole structure looked like it might collapse in a strong gust of wind. Still, someone had been inside more recently than they should have. I could see footprints in the dust and a fresh path through the debris, as if an object had been dragged across the floor. Inside the upper room, among broken chairs and a warped desk, I found a cluster of equipment I did not recognize. It was powered, humming softly, and connected to a screen showing rows of data that looked unmistakably familiar. My data, not just one day's readings, either. Weeks of them, soil patterns, plant growth angles, radio timestamps, temperature shifts, chemical exchange logs. There were even coordinates plotted from places I had never recorded myself. My own measurements were being displayed in a system I had never seen, as though someone or something had been collecting them in real time from somewhere just outside my sight. Then I saw the predictions. Lines of text scrolled across the screen, each one estimating what my work would uncover next. The accuracy was sickening. It listed the behavior changes I had already observed, then moved forward into events I had not yet witnessed. It described an underlying substrate beneath the forest floor. Something not fully soil and not fully stone, a strange layer the models couldn't explain. The notes called it persistent, conductive, and biologically reactive. Every simulation kept failing around it, as if the system itself had reached the edge of what it could compute. I remember standing there with my pulse hammering in my throat, staring at words I did not want to believe. This should not have been possible. I checked the date stamp, the power source, the wiring, the casing, anything that might prove this was an old monitoring setup left behind by another team. But there were no signs of age consistent with the machine's output. It was too clean, too recent, too certain. And then, at the very bottom of the screen, one final line appeared. Countdown completion will initiate full pattern convergence. I left the tower fast, stumbling more than walking. The whole way back down the ridge, I kept feeling as if I were being followed, not by a person, but by the sensation of attention itself. Every branch seemed too still, every shadow looked arranged. Even the wind felt like it was changing direction to keep pace with me. When I got back to the cabin, the radio was already waiting. 2:47 a.m. Again. This time the static was louder, almost violent, and the voice inside it sounded closer than before. The countdown numbers were shorter now. My equipment blinked red across every screen. Outside, the ground around the plots seemed to shift in the darkness, as if the earth were settling into place after being moved. I ran out with a flashlight and nearly dropped it when I saw the whole field. The plants had turned the land into a symbol, not a simple shape, but a vast, intricate design spread across the plots, and into the surrounding forest. Stems bent in long, clean arcs, leaves clustered in repeating clusters, entire sections of growth aligned with one another so perfectly that the pattern could only be seen from above, like something made to be read from the sky. The geometry matched the data from the tower exactly. I stood in the cold, unable to breathe properly, and understood with a clarity that felt worse than fear. The plants had never been reacting to me. They had been responding to something older. The radio wasn't broadcasting from outside the forest. It was coming from within. The countdown had not been warning me about an event. It had been preparing one. I packed everything I could carry before dawn and drove out while the roads were still passable. I never went back to the cabin, and I never filed a report that made it past the first draft. How do you explain that your research site may have been part of a living signal long before you arrived? How do you describe a forest that arranges itself like an equation and seems to know you are watching? Even now, years later, I sometimes hear it at night. Not often. Just enough to make my stomach tighten and my thoughts go cold. A burst of static from nowhere. A pattern hidden inside it. A countdown spoken in a language I still cannot name. And every time I hear it, I remember the tower, the screen full of impossible predictions, and the feeling that somewhere under those trees, something had been listening for a very long time before I ever set foot in the Cascade Mountains. I never thought moving to the middle of nowhere would save me, but after everything fell apart, I didn't have much choice. The city had chewed me up and spit me out, leaving me hollow, anxious, and barely functional. So I packed what little I cared about and drove north to Vermont, to a tiny cottage tucked away in the hills where no one knew my name and no one would ask questions. The place was perfect for disappearing. No neighbors within shouting distance, just trees, silence, and a gravel road that barely saw traffic. Or so I thought. Because about a quarter mile down that road, past a crooked fence and a stretch of overgrown grass, there was her Chloe. I didn't know her name at first. I just saw her out there one morning, standing in the middle of a wide, empty field, shovel in hand, digging. At first, I didn't think much of it. People do weird things in the country, right? Maybe she was planting something, or fixing drainage, or just keeping busy. But then I saw her again the next day, and the day after that, always in the same field, always digging. And here's the thing, she wasn't planting anything. She'd dig a hole, deep and deliberate, then she'd fill it right back in, over and over. Different spots, same ritual. I told myself it wasn't my business. I was supposed to be recovering, focusing on myself, staying out of trouble. But isolation does strange things to your mind. When you have nothing but time and silence, your thoughts start to wander. And mine wandered straight to Chloe in that field. I started watching her more closely. I'd sit by my window with a cup of coffee, pretending to read, but really I was tracking her movements. I learned her schedule. She'd come out around 9 in the morning, work until noon, then disappear. Sometimes she'd return in the late afternoon and dig some more. She never looked tired, never looked frustrated, just calm, methodical, like she was performing some kind of ritual. I became obsessed. I started taking walks that just happened to bring me closer to her property. I'd linger by the fence, pretending to admire the view, but really I was studying the field, counting the disturbed patches of earth, trying to figure out what she was doing. My mind spun wild theories. Was she burying something, hiding evidence? Was she mentally ill, trapped in some compulsive loop? The more I watched, the more I needed to know. It wasn't healthy, I knew that. But I couldn't stop. The mystery consumed me in a way nothing else had since I'd arrived. It gave me purpose, even if that purpose was twisted. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until well after dark, grabbed a flashlight and a small gardening spade, and crossed onto her property. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I told myself I'd just take a quick look, dig into one of the holes she'd filled, see if there was anything there, and leave. No harm done. I chose a spot near the edge of the field, one that looked recently disturbed. The soil was loose, easy to move. I dug carefully, quietly, my hands shaking. A few inches down, my spade hit something soft, I pulled it free, a bundle, wrapped in old fabric, tied with twine. I should have stopped. I should have buried it again and run, but I didn't. I unwrapped it. Inside was clothing, rotted, stained, falling apart. And beneath that, bones. Small, fragile, unmistakably human. I dropped the bundle and stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My mind raced. What had I just found? Who was this? How many more were buried out here? And then I heard her voice. "You shouldn't have done that." I spun around. Chloe was standing a few feet away, perfectly still, her face unreadable in the darkness. I hadn't heard her approach. I hadn't seen any lights. She'd been watching me the whole time. I'm sorry, I stammered, backing away. "I didn't mean to." "Yes, you did," she said calmly. "You've been watching me for weeks." "I know. I've been watching you too." My blood went cold. "I know when you wake up," she continued, stepping closer. "I know when you eat. I know when you sit by that window and stare at me like I'm some kind of puzzle you need to solve. You think I didn't notice?" I couldn't speak, couldn't move. "This field," she said, gesturing around us, "it's not what you think. I'm not burying new secrets. I'm keeping old ones buried. Things that were here long before I was. Things that need to stay hidden. And I do it because if I don't, someone like you comes along and digs them up." She looked at me with something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't pity either. It was recognition. "You and I," she said quietly, "we're the same. We watch, we obsess. We turn people into things we can study and control because it's easier than facing what's broken inside us. You came here to escape, but you brought it with you, and now you've made me part of it." I wanted to argue, to deny it, but I couldn't, because she was right. I had turned her into an object, a distraction, something to fill the void, and in doing so, I'd become exactly what I was running from. I didn't say another word. I just turned and ran, back across the field, back to my cottage, and I didn't stop until I was inside with the door locked. The next morning, I packed everything and left. I drove back to the city, back to the noise and the crowds and the chaos I thought I needed to escape. But I still think about that field, about Chloe, about what else might be buried there. And I think about how easily we become the monsters we're afraid of when we're left alone with our own darkness. The first sign that something was deeply wrong was the barn I passed twice in less than a minute. I was driving a late-night commercial delivery run outside Dubois, Wyoming, following a route I'd taken before without a single problem. It was the kind of dark, open stretch of country where your headlights seem to carve a tunnel through nothing but wind, dust, and endless black. According to my map, I should have been close to the ranch by then. According to the road signs, too. But the landscape had started to feel off in a way I couldn't explain, like the world had slipped a fraction out of alignment. At first, it was small stuff. A fence line that should have been on my left was suddenly on my right. A cluster of twisted cottonwoods I remembered passing 10 minutes earlier showed up again ahead of me, as if I had circled back without ever turning. Then the radio, which had been crackling with static, went dead silent. Not even the usual hiss, just a heavy, unnatural quiet that made the cab feel sealed off from the rest of the world. I checked the time on my dashboard. The numbers looked normal, but somehow they didn't feel true. It was as if the clock was displaying time instead of actually measuring it. I remember glancing up and seeing the same moon in the same place for what felt like too long. Not drifting, not changing, just hanging there, fixed above the road like it had been nailed into the sky. Then I saw the house. It should have been the ranch. That was what the directions said, and that was what I had been expecting. A few low buildings, a weathered gate, maybe a gravel drive leading up to a corral. Instead, sitting where the ranch was supposed to be, there stood a tall Victorian house, all steep roof lines and dark windows, as if some piece of old East Coast history had been dropped into the middle of Wyoming and forgotten there. The porch wrapped around the front. The paint was faded and peeling. A single light glowed in one upstairs window. I sat there with my engine idling, staring at it so hard my eyes began to hurt. The unsettling thing wasn't just that the house was wrong. It was that it looked lived in, not abandoned. The porch steps were clear of dust. The curtains inside were drawn back just enough to suggest someone had been watching from within, and the longer I looked, the more I had the creeping feeling that I was the one intruding, not the other way around. I finally got out of the truck, grabbed my flashlight, and crossed the yard. The air felt colder near the house, the kind of cold that gets under your clothes and settles in your bones. Every step sounded too loud. The wooden porch boards creaked under my weight with a softness that made me think of old houses breathing. The front door was unlocked. That alone should have made me leave. Instead, I pushed it open and stepped into another century. The inside of the house was not just old, it was preserved. Carefully, eerily preserved, like someone had frozen a specific year and place and refused to let it rot. Wallpaper with a floral pattern gone yellow with age lined the walls. A rotary phone sat on a side table. Heavy curtains, velvet and faded, framed the windows. On a credenza in the hallway sat family photographs in silver frames, the faces inside them dressed in clothing that screamed 1970s. A calendar hanging near the kitchen door showed the year 1974. I remember standing in that hallway and feeling a wave of cold panic roll through me, because everything in me understood the same impossible thing at once. This place was not merely old. It was specific, intentional, like it had been left exactly as it had been on purpose. I walked farther in, slowly, trying not to breathe too loudly. The kitchen still held a percolator on the stove. A crocheted dish towel hung from the oven handle. There were dishes drying by the sink, and for one absurd, horrifying second, I thought I heard movement upstairs. I didn't go up. I did not have the courage. Instead, I noticed a framed photograph on the wall near the dining room. It showed the same house, but in daylight, surrounded by open land. Standing on the porch was a woman in a long dress, and beside her was a child with a solemn face. The date written on the back, when I later saw it, matched 1974 exactly. Something about that picture made the skin on my neck tighten. The house in the photo looked normal in a way the real one didn't, as if it had not yet decided to reveal what it really was. I got out of there as fast as I could, nearly tripping over my own feet on the way back to the truck. I did not sleep that night. I spent the rest of the delivery shift with my nerves stretched so tight they felt ready to snap. The next morning, I did what any sane person would do after seeing a Victorian house appear on a Wyoming ranch road like it had fallen out of a dream. I went back and found the property owner. Her name was Maya Morrison. She lived on the ranch, just a few miles from where the road had gone wrong. She was calm in that way some people are when they've already spent years learning how to survive the unexplainable. I expected her to laugh at me, or at least look at me like I'd lost my mind. Instead, she listened without interrupting, then nodded as if I had confirmed something she already suspected. She told me that the land had a reputation, though most people around there preferred not to talk about it. Over the years, travelers had reported strange things happening on that road, distances that changed, familiar landmarks appearing in the wrong order, vehicles that vanished and then reappeared miles away. A few people had even described seeing a house where no house should have been, though most of those reports had been dismissed as exhaustion, bad weather, or plain nonsense. Then Maya told me something that made the whole story sink even deeper into my stomach. Her grandmother had lived on that property decades earlier and had kept detailed notes about the strange shifts. She had written about moments when the ranch seemed to slide into another version of itself, one where the house was still standing in its old form. According to those records, the house had once existed in two states at once, as a modern ranch home and as an older Victorian structure that appeared under certain conditions, like a second layer of reality pressing up through the first. Maya said her grandmother had become obsessed with documenting the phenomenon. She took photographs, made sketches, and recorded the dates and times of every occurrence she could catch. Then, in 1974, she died in a fire inside that house. The official explanation was electrical failure, but Maya's voice changed slightly when she said that part, as if she had repeated it many times and still didn't believe it. What made it worse was the photograph. Maya brought out an old box full of her grandmother's belongings, and inside was the same image I had seen in the house. Same porch, same woman, same child. Even the light in the windows looked familiar. Holding that photograph in my hands felt like touching proof that the place I had walked through wasn't just haunted, it was layered, split. One version of it had burned, but another version, somehow, had remained behind. Maya explained it the best she could. Some roads, she said, don't just lead somewhere. They can loop through different versions of the same somewhere. You think you're driving forward, but you may be crossing a seam in time, slipping from one reality into another without ever feeling the transition. Most people pass through and never notice. A few see the wrong details. Some come back with stories no one believes. And once in a while, someone ends up standing inside the part of the world that didn't fully let go of the past. I asked her whether the house was still there. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. Sometimes, she said. Not always the same way. But yes, I have taken that route many times since then, and every time I do, I watch the land too closely. I check the fence lines. I count the cottonwoods. I keep my eyes on the road until my vision starts to blur from staring. Most nights, the world behaves itself. The ranch looks like a ranch. The road stays put. The air remains ordinary, or as ordinary as Wyoming ever gets at midnight. But I still keep that old photograph in my glove compartment. Every so often, when I'm alone in the truck and the darkness outside feels just a little too deep, I take it out and look at the house standing there in the sun, steady and silent, as if it has been waiting all this time for the road to fold again. And every time I do, I can't help wondering the same thing. If that house existed in more than one time at once, then maybe it still does. Maybe somewhere out there, beyond the stretch of road I know by heart, the world is still bent in exactly the same place. And if I drive far enough and long enough, I might find myself back on that property with the porch light glowing upstairs, the curtains pulled back, and the past waiting just inside the door. It started with one strange detail in the very first photo. Something else was already in the field behind me, even though I had been completely alone. I had moved out to rural Nebraska for a year of isolation, cheap rent, and the kind of silence you can only find where the road turns to gravel and the horizon never seems to end. I wanted to document the whole thing the hard way, one self-portrait a day, same time, same place, same camera on a tripod facing the open land behind an old farmhouse. I liked the discipline of it. Wake up, step outside, set the timer, walk into position, hear the soft click, and repeat. It felt clean and controlled, like I could pin my life down in 365 frozen moments and prove to myself that I had been there at all. For the first week, everything was normal. The light shifted with the weather, the grass bent differently each morning, and my face slowly lost its city stiffness. The farmhouse behind me sat quiet and abandoned, its windows dark, its porch boards weathered gray. Beyond it, the field stretched out in rough gold waves, broken only by a windmill and a line of dead fence posts. I never expected anything from those pictures, except a record of my own routine. Then, on the 8th day, I noticed a smudge near the edge of the frame. At first I assumed it was dust on the lens or a fault in the file, but when I zoomed in, my stomach tightened. It wasn't on the lens, it was standing out in the field, behind me, thin and unfocused, too tall to be a shadow, and too still to be moving in the wind. The figure looked almost like a person caught between steps, washed out by distance and camera glare. I told myself I had missed it while setting up. Maybe a neighbor had wandered by. Maybe I had simply not been paying attention. The next morning, I checked the field before starting. No one was there. No tire tracks, no footprints, nothing but crushed grass and morning dew. I set the timer, moved into place, and took the picture. It was there again. This time it was clearer, though still blurred at the edges, standing a little closer to the farmhouse than before. I stared at the image until my eyes watered. The shape was wrong in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just human-shaped. It had my posture, same tilt of the shoulders, same slight bend in one knee, same habit of letting my right hand hang a little lower than the left when I wasn't thinking about it. I went back outside and searched the field until noon. Nothing. No people. No animals. No sound except the wind sliding through the weeds and tapping at the loose boards on the porch. That evening, I convinced myself it was a trick of perspective, some accidental alignment of fence post, grass, and light. I even laughed at how quickly my mind had tried to turn a glitch into a ghost story, but the following days made it impossible to laugh. In each new photo, the figure stayed in the background and came incrementally closer. One day it was near the fence line. Then it was halfway between the fence and the farmhouse. Then it stood just beyond the porch steps, always faint, always out of focus, but unmistakably present. What made my skin crawl wasn't just that it was approaching, it was that it never appeared random. It seemed to know where I would stand before I stood there. Sometimes I would shift my position by a foot or turn my shoulders slightly, and in the picture it would be matching me, almost in sync, as if it had been trying to practice being me. I stopped sleeping well. I started checking the room at night before I closed my eyes. I checked under the bed, in the closet, behind the curtain, even though I knew how ridiculous that sounded in a house that old. I began taking the camera indoors with me after each shot. I deleted nothing. I kept every image in a folder and reviewed them over and over, hoping some ordinary explanation would eventually reveal itself if I stared long enough. It never did. By the third week, the thing in the photos was close enough that I could see more than just shape: the outline of my jacket, the cut of my hair, the angle of my head when I looked toward the lens. It was copying me, not perfectly, but with enough precision to make the resemblance unbearable. In one picture, I had my hands in my pockets. The figure did too. In another, I was leaning slightly onto my left leg. It mirrored that as well. In the next image, I had turned my face away from the camera for a second, and the figure had done the same. Each time I looked at the newest photo, I felt less like the observer and more like the one being studied. I stopped taking the camera out for a day, then two. Nothing happened in the real world. The field remained empty. The farmhouse creaked in the wind. The nights dragged on, but the absence made the photos even worse. When I finally resumed the routine, the figure was waiting in the frame as if my pause had never mattered. Closer still, more defined. Its face still hidden by blur, but the shape of it increasingly familiar, like a memory I had almost recovered. The worst picture came on a gray afternoon, when the sky hung low and the wind smelled like rain. I set the timer, took my place, and tried not to think about the shape behind me. When I retrieved the camera and checked the shot, my mouth went dry. The figure was no longer behind me in the distance. It was standing exactly where I should have been, occupying my spot, as if I had stepped out of the frame a moment too soon. The background was the same field, the same farmhouse, the same dead sky, but the arrangement was wrong in a way that made my chest tighten. I was in the picture, yes, but only as a half-formed blur near the edge, while the clearer version of me stood in center frame with my body angled toward the lens. I remember standing there in the dirt, staring at that image, and feeling the world tilt slightly off balance. I hadn't just seen a copy, I had seen a replacement. I could have stopped then. I should have packed my things, driven out before dark, and never looked back. Instead, some stubborn, terrified part of me needed one final answer. I needed to know whether the thing in the photos was following me, or whether it had been waiting for the exact moment to take my place. So I set the camera one last time, but this time I did something different. I left the tripod pointed toward the field, stepped behind the camera, and used the timer to photograph what was behind me instead of in front of me. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the remote. The camera beeped. The seconds counted down. I held my breath. The shutter snapped. When I looked at the screen, I nearly threw the camera into the dirt. There, in the image, was the figure again. Only now it had turned around. It was facing the camera directly, and the blur that had hidden its face for days was gone just long enough for me to see the truth underneath. It was my own face. Not similar, not close, mine. Every detail I knew too well: the shape of the mouth, the line of the nose, the tired eyes that had spent too many nights staring at those photos, was staring back at me from the field, like it had been waiting for me to understand. I ran. I didn't grab my bags. I didn't lock the door. I just got in my car and tore down that dirt road so fast the tires spit rocks into the weeds. I didn't stop until the farmhouse was a memory and the gas light came on. I told myself the image had broken something in my mind, that stress and isolation had twisted an ordinary sequence of photos into a nightmare. That explanation lasted until I got home. The camera was still in the bag. I had never shut it off. And when I checked the memory card, there were more photos. I had left the field. I had driven away, but the camera had kept firing on its own, frame after frame, hour after hour, as if someone were still there pressing the shutter with patient, practiced hands. In the first of those new images, the figure stood alone in my place. In the next, it had turned toward the farmhouse. In the next, it was setting up the tripod. In the next, it was stepping into position for the daily shot. It was continuing the project, without me. The photos went on for pages, days, maybe weeks. I stopped counting after a while, because the sequence was getting harder to bear. The figure became clearer in each one. Straighter, more certain, more like a man who belonged there. And then, eventually, the face sharpened enough for me to see that it wasn't only copying my body. It was learning my expression, my habits, my tiredness, my way of looking at the world, as if I had always expected something terrible to happen and had simply been waiting for proof. I still don't know which one of us was original. Maybe I was the person who started the project, and the other thing learned me too well. Maybe I was the copy, built out of repetition, routine, and a year of standing in the same exact spot until the world decided I had become replaceable. Maybe the real answer is worse than both. What I do know is this: I no longer trust mirrors, because sometimes the face looking back seems just a second too slow to react. I don't trust shadows, because they can move when nothing else does. And I definitely don't trust that tiny empty space between deciding to do something and actually doing it, because that's where I think he lived, or maybe where I